the presentation for questions and discussion. And then we'll also give folks an opportunity, those who have asked questions, the opportunity to provide any clarifications or follow-ups, and you can unmute yourself at that time and make those additional points if necessary. If you are on the phone and don't have the chat functionality, we'll also pause at times to check to see if anyone has questions or comments, and at that point you can unmute yourself and ask your question. You should have all received an agenda in your meeting invite. Utility data and data collection are going to be a big focus of today's meeting. This COVID-19 situation has some challenges that we want to talk about regarding primary data collection. So that'll be one of the focuses of this meeting today. We also did want to circle back around on the discussion on achievable potential that came up during the first stakeholder meeting, so that this group can hear more on that, and we can talk about the opportunities with this study in terms of how the report presents potential and what would be beneficial to you as stakeholders as well as to decision makers. And at the end, leave plenty of time for questions and answers and discussion. I did want to take a minute just to kind of reorient everyone to the timeline for the potential study. So the potential study is really the first major activity that goes into quad planning for the next quad of focus. Where we're at right now is where those light blue circles are. The study really kicked off in earnest in May. Cadmus and their team have been combing through the data and are ready to talk about primary data collection today, that this being the second stakeholder meeting. There's going to be follow-up stakeholder meetings along the way, which with the next one looking out to toward the end of summer, early fall, to focus on measure characterization. We'll talk more about that as we wrap up this meeting. But following this timeline, we're on track for modeling to occur during the winter, draft results to come out of that sometime in the spring, and ultimately a report next summer that will lead into the scoping phase of Quad 4. There will also be public input opportunities. I also did just want to take a minute to remind folks of the scope and objectives of the potential study. So as a reminder, the potential study is focused on energy efficiency potential, and renewable energy is outside of the study scope. This is the same scope as it was for the last potential study that was completed in 2017. What the potential study looks to do is to quantify energy efficiency potential and the opportunities available in the market over the planning period. And the study period for this potential study is a 12-year period beginning in 2023 and extending out through 2034. And so, as I mentioned, the potential study is a key piece of information that goes along with additional research and analysis to inform commission decisions on the scope for Quad 4 of focus. And your participation in this process as stakeholders is extremely valuable, and we're very happy to have you part of this effort to provide your expertise and insights along the way, and looking forward to working with you all as this study progresses along the way. So I could pause there if there's any kind of high level questions on what I've talked about here up at the front of the meeting, but if not, I can hand it over to Lakin at Cadmus, who's going to walk us through the remainder of the agenda.
Okay, thank you, Mitch. Can everyone hear me okay? Steve, am I still coming in all right?
I hear you.
Yes, you are coming in okay. The presentation needs to be shown though.
Okay, I'm going to pull it up on my end real quick. Let's see here. All right, how's it look now, Steve?
Looks good.
All right, well, thanks everyone, and thank you, Mitch, for the introduction. Again, my name is Lakin Garth, and my role in the project is primary analytic lead. And so, as Mitch mentioned, the focus of today's call is to discuss primary data collection and to circle back around to some of the topics we discussed related to achievable potential in the initial study kickoff meeting back on May 7th. And so we're going to begin talking first about data that we've collected from utilities directly. And I'm going to provide an overview of what information we've requested and what our team has been up to over the course of the last 7 weeks since we last met. I'm going to show some summaries of that data and discuss a little bit about how that information gets incorporated into the potential study more broadly. This first section is more of, unfortunately for you, a bit more of me presenting and discussing the information that we've gathered and what we've done with it, and less of a discussion. But I do want to make sure that we leave time to answer any questions that you have, in particular around data that we collect from utilities and how we use it within the potential study. So first, I just want to provide a quick overview. Most of the utility data that we collect informs our segmentation. And so the primary purpose of the utility provided data is to first create baseline energy and customer forecasts, but we also create sampling data frames that are reflective of the focus territory. And so the baseline energy and customer forecasts are required for the 12-year study period for both electric and natural gas within the focus on energy service territory. And so we collect all that information from the utilities themselves. And then we have a second part of the data request related to individual customer specific information that we ultimately use to develop sample frames for primary data collection. So my colleagues are going to speak a little bit later in this meeting about the primary data collection, but the main source of information that we get to develop those sample frames of utility customers comes directly from the utilities themselves. And so we're very grateful for their involvement and for their patience over the course of the last 7 weeks. There's been an awful lot of back and forth, and we really appreciate everyone's responsiveness who've provided us data and who helped answer all sorts of technical questions related to what we see. Without their involvement, this sort of work wouldn't be possible. So the sources of data themselves include utility-specific non-residential and residential customer billing data. The non-residential data is provided at a very granular level. We actually capture entire non-residential customer population information. So that would, in effect, account for every non-residential customer within focus on energy service territory for the utilities who are able to provide data. Again, some of the smaller public utilities we don't have a data request for, but we did get information from all the IOUs as well as from WPPI and Manitowoc. We also request residential customer billing data, but that information is an aggregate. So it's really just summarized at an individual utility level for each fuel type. We also requested energy and demand forecasts. And so each utility has graciously provided us with that information. And those forecasts also include individual customer counts at the sector level. So it's a really rich data set that we ultimately have to combine across all the utilities to come up with a focus specific baseline customer energy demand forecast. Other sources of data that I'm going to talk about include public data sources and census data, and I'll speak to those here in just a minute. But most of the information that we use is collected directly from utilities, but we do have to supplement it in some instances. The next step is that we clean all the data, review it, and then we compare it to historical and publicly available data for reasonableness. So with respect to data cleaning, that's primarily looking through all the non-residential customer data sets to ensure that we're looking at the right number of customers, the right amount of energy for a given period of time, and that we're excluding customers who would be ineligible to participate in focus programs like transport gas and perhaps some others. And then, of course, if we have PPI, we have to make sure that our analysts don't view that information. And we've requested those data sets, including billing data for an entire calendar year, 2019 in this instance. And so once we've summarized it, we take it and we compare it to publicly available information for reasonableness, just to ensure that there's nothing wildly off about the total values that we're seeing. And so generally speaking, when we segment the non-residential customer population, we first look at those customer counts and their energy sales at a sector level, so commercial or industrial. And it's at that level we can compare to data sources like the United States Energy Information Administration Form 861 that utilities are required to fill for reporting to Congress. And we can compare it to historical values to make sure that there's nothing wildly off. And then occasionally we run into some things that that generate questions, and we've done quite a bit of follow-up with utilities throughout this process as needed. And once we've reviewed the data, then the next steps are to utilize these aggregated adjusted forecasts and segmentation data to create sampling frames. Again, we'll talk more about primary data collection later in this presentation, but we do create very, very specific sampling frames for either surveys or the proposed site visits. And so if we want to visit office buildings, for example, then we have to build sample frames of all the customer accounts that we believe occupy office space within focus on energy service territory. So that sample frame looks at both electric and gas consumption, and it's combined across all the utilities who provided us individual customer account data. And then we go through that process for every other building type, as well as for industrial customers and agricultural. And then the next step is that ultimately we have to create baseline forecasts from which we estimate potential study savings. And so that's an overview of how we gather the data, what sources we gather the data from, how we review the data and get it ready for use, and then a little bit of information about the next steps. So in the next series of slides, I'm going to start presenting information that summarizes our progress to date for these various components. And I'm going to begin with electric, and I'm going to begin at a high level and start with the overall 12-year study horizon electric energy forecast. And then from there, we'll look in more detail at what our initial segmentation looks like for the non-residential sectors as well as for the residential. So someone may be unmuted there in the background. But so this slide 7, does show the sector level electric energy forecast for the 12-year study horizon from 2023 through 2034. And generally speaking, I'll just say that it starts around between 70 and 71,000 gigawatt hours, and grows to a value just over 73,000 gigawatt hours. So over a 12-year period, it's about a 4% increase in energy in total for the utilities that comprise Focus on Energy's service territory. It's hard to pick up from this slide, but there is a slight decrease in electric use within the residential sector. On average, it's about 0.25% per year over the 12-year study horizon, whereas for commercial and for industrial, it does increase over time. So just a couple other things I'll mention regarding the electric energy forecast. We do obviously take all the data from the utilities and aggregate it, but we also do make some minor adjustments to account for focus participating utilities that didn't provide data. And so for example, if there are a number of public utilities who we didn't request individual sales forecasts from, we look to see what share of the total Focus on Energy service territory those represent, and then we just simply apply a percentage increase to our baseline forecast to account for their data. So all told, it equals to be about, load growth on an average annual basis of about 3 0.3% and about between 3.5% and 4% for electric over the 12-year period. Next slide, slide 8, is an electric demand forecast. This is something that is new to the Focus on Energy potential study that we did not include previously in the 2017 study. Our primary models for estimating energy efficiency potential are energy-based models, but I think as we discussed in the kickoff meeting on May 7th, and as some stakeholders are aware, there is more intent behind this potential study to estimate what peak demand savings are from energy efficiency and to report those and to provide examples of measures and recommendations for measures in areas and markets of the study that may have more relative peak demand potential than others. And so we felt that it was a good idea to go ahead and request demand forecasts from the electric utilities at the same time we were requesting energy forecasts. And so this slide shows the initial forecast that we've developed. The blue line that says utility data is looking forward. Again, the study horizon is 2023 through 2034. But because this information is new or newer to our study team, we did also provide EIA data from to provide a historical perspective. And then, of course, we're still only in 2020, so there's a couple of data points before the study timeline really starts to just help provide the demand forecast in context. And the slope of the line looks a bit more like there's more growth here, but I think the vertical axis shows that it is actually starting at about 14,000 megawatt hours on the vertical axis and then up to 16.5. But if we flatten it out and went from 0 to 16.5, we'd see that the slope of the demand forecast is actually almost identical to the slope of the energy forecast in aggregate. And so from the first study year to the end of the study period, we're looking at about 3.8% growth in peak demand from the data that's been provided to us by utilities. So that's roughly equivalent with what we see on the energy side. Last thing I'll say here, we did have to make a similar adjustment to the demand forecast as we did to the energy forecast for utilities who were unable to provide us data because we didn't request, a demand forecast from every single utility. So sticking with electric, I'm just going to go through the next few slides in a bit more rapidly. The first two really showed the energy forecast in aggregate and then at a sector level. The demand forecast is just an aggregate. Most utilities who I've worked with, and certainly the utilities that provided us data, typically look at demand in aggregate. It's a lot more challenging to parse out demand forecasts at a sector level. And so we don't have that level of granularity here. It's just an aggregate for electric peak demand. But then the next series of slides starts to move into how we segment the individual sectors into their respective segments. And so there's a lot of detail on this slide and the two that follow it. I'm not going to go through every data point here, but part of today's presentation was to provide a progress update on where we are with respect to segmentation of the constituent loads into their respective segments. And I just wanted to provide this level of detail, publicly, make sure that I explain where we get the data from, how we do the segmentation, so that later on, as we start to show first our measure lists and how those apply to different segments, and then later the results, that we have a basis of comparison going back in time. And so the first slide shows the commercial sector and industrial electric segmentation. So commercials there on top, and then you see each of the color bands. The legend corresponds to the different building types within the commercial sector. When we request data from the utilities, as I mentioned earlier, we were requesting entire non-residential customer population data sets. And with those data sets, a number of utilities are able to provide customer NAICS codes or SIC codes that we then use to map to specific building segments. And so that's primarily how we segment both the customer counts and the segment share of the overall load, is using information that's provided by utilities. There are some gaps in those data sets, and so we do spend quite a bit of time going through them either on a keyword basis or a manual basis to make sure that we map as much of the sales and as many of the counts as we can to their respective building segments. I will say this is still a bit of a work in progress. We were working with one or two utilities on some final assumptions about the data that were provided. And so overall, I'd say that the distributions will change slightly from what's shown on this slide to when we actually start estimating the potential later this fall. But generally, this is about where we would expect it to fall out. But we do have a little bit of tweaking left to do. Last thing I'll point out, we've got 11 commercial segments, and then you'll see the very large number of industrial segments. Most of those industrial segments correspond to 2-digit or 3-digit NAICS classifications, but we also add in some non-building or non-facility loads into the industrial model, including, you'll see down there, street lighting, wastewater, water, and then the mining segments. And we include those within industrial based on how we characterize the potential. And so when we estimate industrial potential, we're using primarily a top-down methodology, which differs from the bottom-up methodology that we use for the commercial and residential sector. So loads and segments that are typically non-building segments, oftentimes we do include within industrial, but we obviously have the ability to report the savings for the individual segment levels once we estimate them. The next slide is similar to the first, but we start getting into the public sector electric energy segmentation, where we're looking at state or government or municipal owned offices, other buildings, and then schools. And then below that, we have the agricultural sector, where we've got several different segments: dairy, fruit and vegetable production, and all those that you can see listed below. So we do look at the potential for agricultural separately, and we do a pretty detailed segmentation of the number of customers and their respective loads across those different segments for the agricultural sector. Last slide I'll show for electric customer segmentation is residential. So this one will probably change somewhat between now and then when we start to estimate the potential. We actually build the residential segmentation from the bottom up, meaning that we start with customer counts for each of the 6 segments you see here, or 5 segments you see here. And then we're using, very specific end-use saturations and fuel shares and unit energy consumptions in order to come up with the overall characterization for the residential electric sector. And so this slide, it depicts, generally about where we expect to land based on the distribution of usage by these segments from the previous study, and then the total usage that we see in the base year for the current study. So residential will be one that is a work in progress up until we start estimating potential.
Hey, Lakin.
Hey, Steve.
Before we move into the gas forecast, there's 2 questions from Kathy that I think pertain to the electric side. The first one is Kathy notes that there's about 1/3 of Wisconsin residents now live in the communities with aggressive climate goals. Is there any way that this is integrated into the energy forecast? And then the second question is, does the electric forecast include growth of electric vehicles?
That's a great question. 2 great questions. So the first one, with respect to Wisconsin communities that have goals for climate targets, I think that to the extent that any of the electric utilities would alter their short-term electric forecast to account for those targets, it would be included. It's not clear to me that is the case, and admittedly, we did not ask that question when we requested the energy and customer forecasts. So I don't know if there are specific utilities who've made adjustments to their underlying customer or electric load forecasts to account for climate targets. I will say that in aggregate, we do see, and the data that have been provided to us by the utilities, we do see the residential sector electric usage overall is declining, and then it's also declining slightly on a per customer basis. So my sense is that it may be, but maybe not, especially if one would expect to see electrification in the future as a response to climate targets. We would expect to see those loads increasing both in aggregate and on a per customer basis, and that doesn't appear to be the case. The second question about electric vehicles is a good one, and I don't have a good answer to that question. We didn't specifically request from the utilities forecasts, their individual forecasts of electric vehicles, nor did we question if such loads were included in the overall electric sector and aggregate load forecasts. So Steve, that might be one that we need to mark as a follow-up question for the utilities. The good news is it's June, and we won't be doing any potential modeling for some months. So if we need to make adjustments there, we have plenty of time, but we wouldn't need to circle back with the folks who provided us with forecasts and ask them that specifically.
Sounds good, Lake, and those were all the questions right now.
Okay, thanks, Steve, and thank you, Kathy. So let's see here. With respect to the gas forecast, I'll try to say less, but still spend an appropriate amount of time here. But the process for how we collected the data, how we cleaned it, how we reviewed it, and aggregated data was almost identical to what we did on the electric side. The biggest difference is that when we check for reasonableness, it's a different EIA form. It's form 176 that natural gas utilities fill. And then we also had to do a little bit more back and forth to ensure that we were incorporating the correct customers. If you have industrial transport customers who are not eligible for focus programs in the underlying forecast, it can throw things off dramatically. So very grateful for all the patience and willingness to answer very detailed questions on behalf of the utilities that our staff have been lobbing at them over the course of the last 7 weeks. Just generally speaking, when we look at the aggregate gas forecast, there's a few differences worth pointing out relative to the electric forecast. First, we see, at least from the data provided to us by the utilities, we do see more gas sales growth over time. So over the 12-year study horizon, it's about 7.5%. And so that equates to, give or take about 0.6% on average per year over the study horizon. And we see most of that growth within the residential sector, pretty consistently around 0.7% per year on average. And commercial and industrial are also growing, but to a lesser degree. And then we also see, one primary difference between gas and electric is that we see that the residential sector actually accounts for a much greater percentage of the overall gas sales than it does for electric. So, that we would expect to see that, but just something worth pointing out. And then the industrial is relatively small compared to the other two sectors. On the next slide, so we did not request, nor did we receive any gas peak demand forecasts. There are multiple ways of looking at gas peak demand, and it can be quite a bit more challenging. But the primary focus on demand so far for this study has been on the electric side, and so really for natural gas, we're focused on the actual therm sales themselves for estimating potential. And so moving directly from the sector and aggregate level forecast to the customer segmentation, again, I think I'm not going to try to repeat myself too much here. It's a very similar process that we employ on the electric side, but we do see the distribution changing somewhat, both by commercial segment and by industrial sector. Of course, depending upon heating loads and water heating loads in the commercial sector, and then in the industrial sector, some industries are going to be more, have more intensive gas process uses than others, and that usually bears itself out in the data pretty clearly. Also, we looked at, again, public sector natural gas energy segmentation as well as agriculture. And we look at it again, looking at the same exact segments that we included on the electric side, but of course, just trying to segment what we think the relative shares of consumption are by the different segments within these sectors. Similar to the electric side, when we do the residential natural gas energy segmentation, it's a bottom-up process, and so this will change over the course of the next few months as we do the measure characterization, as we collect primary data. It's really a bottom-up process where we start with the number of customers with natural gas service, and we look at end-use saturations and the end-use consumption for those various natural gas consuming end uses. And then we basically build a bottom-up forecast and look at the distribution from housing type to housing type for each of the 5 that are listed here. And so the overall sales in the base year are represented on this slide, but the distributions represent roughly what we came up with in the last potential study. But we provided it here just to give people a sense of how much gas is being consumed in the residential sector. And then we see that, in the last study we found, about 87% of it was within the single family housing stock. And that's pretty typical. So in summary, just wanted to again thank the many people who've been working with us, provided data from the utilities, have participated in phone calls and answered emails and questions that we've had. The vast majority of the information that we've used to create the baseline energy and customer forecast, as well as the customer segmentation, is being provided directly by the utilities. We've also spent a lot of time checking the data for reasonableness, comparing utility data sets to what was provided in the last potential study to make sure that counts of customers and loads were similar. And then also other publicly available benchmarks, including EIA forms 861 and 176. We have those with the time series, so we can check and see how we measure up against historical data to make sure there's nothing off there. And then, of course, we followed up with a lot of questions as needed. And then finally, we did leverage secondary sources as needed and use those to fill gaps, such as for the participating utilities who didn't provide us data, so that we could make adjustments to the overall customer and load forecasts for both electric energy, electric demand, and then gas energy as well. So Steve, I'll pause there. That concludes the utility data section.
Yep, we have one question from Ben at Evergreen. I think it's Evergreen Economics. He says the growth in gas forecast is interesting given the current focus on electrification within energy efficiency. Will you incorporate any sensitivity analysis or variance scenarios for the ultimate potential analysis?
Yeah, thanks, Ben. That's a great question. Up until now, we haven't planned as part of the primary potential study to include any load forecast sensitivities for electrification. If we did, or if we were to consider that, I think we would have to spend a good bit of time thinking about what we think the effects are, both in the short run, and then probably, more importantly, the cumulative effects in the long run would be more pronounced. I will state that it's a 12-year study beginning in 2023 through 2034. And the primary focus on the outputs of the study is in the first quadrennium, so 2023 through 2026. And so, I don't think the utilities themselves, I certainly don't want to speak on behalf of the utilities, but I don't know to what degree any sort of sensitivities have already been incorporated in their underlying customer load forecast. If I had to guess, I would say probably not a lot. But yeah, to answer your question again, we currently haven't, nor do we plan on looking at any changes to the underlying load or forecast based on sensitivities related to electrification policies.
Great. That's the last question, Lakin.
Okay, thanks, Steve. Well, as I mentioned earlier, we do have, we will be sharing this information and publishing this slide deck to the potential study website. And so if anyone does have questions at any point in the future, I think my email address is going to be on the last slide of this presentation. I've done a number of these potential studies, and they're always a lot of fun when we get out of the single utility sphere and start looking at multiple utilities and coming up with an aggregated customer and energy forecast is a critical input to the study. And it's quite challenging when you get data from so many disparate data sources. And so I'll certainly welcome any questions that anyone else has at any point in time about our process. Again, I don't think we can share information regarding individual utility forecasts, but I'm happy to talk through or answer any questions about what we see in aggregate or how those were compiled. So just doing a quick time check, I've got about a quarter till, and we're going to next move into the achievable potential section. And I'm going to guide us through this discussion as well. It's fewer slides, but certainly, as we discussed when we kicked off the study stakeholder discussion 7 weeks ago, it's a topic that is very important to both the outcomes of the potential study itself, and then how those outcomes help feed into the next quadrennium planning process. So as promised, we wanted to come back and discuss achievable potential in a bit more detail than we were able to get to in the first stakeholder meeting. So just as a quick recap, for those folks who don't do this every day or who don't have a whole lot of exposure to energy efficiency potential studies, we and when I say we, I think I mean this study itself plans to estimate potential at 3 different levels. And this graph on slide 18 depicts sort of a classical view of the definitions of each of these 3 levels of potential, which are technical, economic, and achievable. And again, technical potential is defined as a theoretical maximum energy that can be displaced by efficiency. So the only real limitations on technical potential are technical limitations related to whether or not certain energy efficiency measures can be installed in certain instances. Technical potential is largely informed by underlying load forecasts and saturations of end-use equipment, and then also by engineering assumptions and engineering data that we use to come up with per unit savings for energy efficiency measures. And we call it a theoretical maximum because, the study is bound by time. It's looking forward on a 12-year basis. And we're making an assumption when the study begins that all the efficiency available to us over the 12-year study horizon is going to come from measures and technologies that we know are commercially available today. And so we're making no future prognostications about new technologies or currently existing technologies that become massively more efficient beyond current levels today. And so that goes into defining the technical potential. Economic potential generally serves as a subset of technical potential. And here, the primary difference is now that we're going to apply cost-benefit analysis and compare on a measure-by-measure basis the present value of the benefits of those energy efficiency measures to supply-side alternatives. And if those pass the benefit cost test based on a modified TRC in the state of Wisconsin, then we'll deem those measures economically cost-effective. And so at this point, the economic potential, serving as a subset of technical potential, should provide benefits from a TRC perspective to ratepayers within the state of Wisconsin. And then the third level, achievable potential, again, the definition is to account for real-world barriers and non-measured costs of delivering programs. And so it's a subset of economic potential, which is, of course, a subset of technical potential. And as you can see, we step down and the overall potential becomes smaller as we move from technical to economic to achievable. And the achievable potential is intended to account for particularly how customers respond to technologies and their willingness to adopt those over time, in addition to any barriers to delivering programs. And so the program targets in the past, the current quadrennium, were developed in part based on the achievable potential that was estimated in the 2017 potential study, but of course went through a comprehensive planning process during the Quad 3 planning process a couple of years ago. So just another recap of our study approach from the previous study. We developed different measure adoption scenarios through survey research. And those scenarios were based on customers' responses to a battery of survey questions regarding their willingness to pay or to participate in energy efficiency programs. And those scenarios ask questions like, are you aware of this technology? And would you participate in this program if an incentive covering 25% of the incremental costs were offered, 50%, 75%, or 100%? And so when we get answers to those questions from customers, we can develop cumulative response rates on a percentage basis. And those percents are used to estimate the percent of long-term economic potential that is achievable. And so, again, as we see the incentive amounts go up, covering those different rates of incremental costs, we see the cumulative percents rise. They don't rise on a linear basis, and they also change depending upon the technology, depending upon customers' awareness of that technology, and depending upon the overall amount of the incremental cost. So that sets the first step in estimating achievable potential, is what we think the maximum long-term percent of economic potential that can actually be achieved. And again, this is a 12-year study. So if we ask a customer, will you adopt an air source heat pump if there's an incentive that's equal to 50% of the incremental cost, and 60% of the customers say that yes, we'll do that, then we're basically saying that 60% of the economic potential can be achieved over a 12-year time horizon. And so that gets us a total value, but we still need to look at annual rates of adoption to get to the cumulative 60%. And so in the second step of estimating achievable potential in 2016, we worked to develop adoption ramp rates, looking at historical data of adoption of various energy efficiency technologies by Focus on Energy customers and Wisconsin ratepayers. And we applied measure-specific ramp rates to these adoption scenarios. And so, for example, some technologies with which there was greater familiarity, greater awareness, and say lower first cost and demonstrated uptake in the market, those on average would have a faster ramp rate than newer technologies with which customers had less familiarity, less awareness, and first cost was high. And so the ramp rates really help the achievable potential arrive at annual estimates. So that's the second step. And so during the course of the 2016 and 2017 study, we did get stakeholder feedback, both as the study progressed and then as we developed draft and final reports from stakeholders who believe that the surveys asking willingness to pay battery of questions in customer surveys is an imperfect method for estimating future customer choices, and that consumers themselves are faced with evolving options, especially over time, and consistently changing contexts and marketplaces. And so generally speaking, it is quite difficult for customers and for anyone really to predict what they're going to do in the future. And so that is the primary criticism of using willingness to pay as a method for establishing long run achievable potential percents of economic potential. And currently in 2020, we've gotten additional stakeholder feedback that conducting this type of willingness to pay research during a pandemic poses additional challenges. First of all, I think, as we're all aware, the pandemic, in addition to providing a very tenuous situation for public health, has also essentially put the U.S. in various parts of the country in a recessionary state. The overall unemployment rate is much higher than it was when we conducted this study just a few years ago. In fact, the overall unemployment rate's much higher than it was just 5 months ago. And so there's some belief on behalf of stakeholders that conducting this research at this point in time may potentially bias the answers even more. And so this is some of the feedback that we received directly. We wanted to make sure that we took time today to mention it and to provide an avenue for discussion. So in the weeks since the last stakeholder meeting, we pulled together some options for estimating achievable potential that that have been observed in other potential studies, conducted elsewhere outside of the state of Wisconsin. And a lot of this information we actually presented back in January of 2020 at a Focus on Energy Evaluation Working Group meeting. And so today I just wanted to summarize some of that information that we presented then for the stakeholder audience today. And so this first slide 20, presents a couple of different options. The first one we're calling data-driven, and that's really the method that I've described already, where we use a willingness to pay battery of survey questions to estimate the percent of economic potential that is achievable in the long run. And I've listed its strengths and limitations. Primarily, it is a fairly simple way to estimate achievable potential. It's relatively easy to implement. It basically requires updating a battery of questions and making sure that we include some research around incremental costs when we pose those questions to customers. And it also serves as a good basis of comparison to the results from the previous potential study where we used a similar methodology. And then the last strength is that it is based on survey data that we've collected directly from Wisconsin customers and ratepayers. And those include residential customers, but they also include commercial customers as well as industrial and agricultural. So we did ask willingness to pay batteries for each of those customers in the previous potential study, but obviously the types of questions themselves changed, quite dramatically across the different sectors, because residential homeowners are faced with a whole different set of options than our, commercial energy management and facility managers. Limitations of the data-driven approach using willingness to pay is that it does require very careful consideration in the wording of the questions themselves and how they're posed, as well as messaging and communications of the results for the potential studies themselves, and they do provide point estimates, and what I mean by that is for each question that we ask, we do get a cumulative response rate that is a specific percentage value, and so it does provide a point estimate where we know that when we're looking forward 12 years and estimating achievable potential, the likelihood is that achievable potential is probably better represented as a range. So that summarizes the data-driven approach. Other approaches listed on the right-hand part of the slide, where we're referring to as predetermined values. And so, I personally have done a number of studies in the Pacific Northwest energy efficiency potential studies. And so the Northwest Power and Conservation Council uses a predetermined value to estimate the percent of economic potential that is determined to be achievable. And that value is 85%. Through about the first 35 years of the council's work as a regional power planning entity for the 4 Northwest states, they used that set value. Only currently have they started to deviate from that value, but only slightly. And it's actually for some measures that have expected future federal standards changes or state code changes, that value is set at 95%. The other methods for using predetermined values, the state of Minnesota completed a statewide energy efficiency potential study a couple years ago, and it relied on secondary data, basically collected from other potential studies that looked at a maximum achievable scenario based on incentives covering 100% of the incremental cost, and a program achievable scenario that looked at incentives covering 50% of the cost. And those values were benchmarked from other potential studies. And so this is another option. Its strengths are it's very simple to implement, and it's a very simple approach. It requires almost no major effort to come up with these values, but its limitations are pretty obvious. It is very simplistic. It's not based on customer survey information, nor is it based on state data. And it can also be a lightning rod for criticism from stakeholders, as I've witnessed over the years. But again, it is an option, so we wanted to put that out there.
Hey, Lakin.
Hey, Steve.
Before we get in to this next slide, Kathy has a few questions. And Kathy, I don't know if you want to go on mute and ask those, or I can read them if you prefer.
Sure, I can just, first, Lakin, I appreciate you coming back to this and talking through some options. I have to confess, when I look at this slide, I take a deep sigh that we call the first method data-driven when the data is a survey methodology that there's no behavioral science behind. What behavioral science tells us is that when we ask people to predict what they will do in the future, they think about their own past experiences. So that facility manager in an industrial facility is going to think about the last time he pitched a project to corporate. He's not necessarily going to think about the fact that corporate over this next decade is likely to adopt some aggressive climate goals and approve more of his projects. There's just not that. So it's not just residential customers, it's across them. And particularly given how critical this next decade is on a climate perspective, I'm just really concerned that we not underestimate the potential that efficiency can deliver. And the longer I think about this issue, the more I end up in the camp that we shouldn't even talk about achievable potential. Achievable is a loaded word here. It makes it sound like some things are impossible. And really what limits our ability to achieve energy efficiency is the funding that Focus has. So I sort of want to start a crusade to rename this like funding constrained potential, or something that makes it clearer to policymakers what really is the constraint. Because given greater resources, I'm absolutely confident the Focus team could grow markets more quickly. And so and maybe you'll talk about this under reframing, but to me, it seems like there's a potential, and I thought that I saw somewhere that maybe ComEd just did this, to just skip the achievable discussion entirely and talk about here what is the economic potential, and then of course acknowledge that there are funding constraints. Focus doesn't have the funding to do all of that, but to have that discussion in a more transparent way for policy folks and not use this term achievable, which makes it sound like some things are impossible.
This is John Nickel. If you can hear me, I will second that wholeheartedly. Appreciate that, Kathy.
This is Robin Lasewski. I would third that and confirm that ComEd with Dunsky omitted achievable potential from their most recent potential study.
This is John. Since we're on the topic, I'll also add my thoughts that I wanted to raise eventually, which was that we have 20 years with the focus program of achieving savings goals that have been evaluated each year. I'm hoping that that is being taken into account. And I think it goes to Kathy's point that, we have used our budget pretty much every year as, we've tried to max out the savings. And again, that's been evaluated in terms of free ridership and other things. So I'm hoping that that is being leaned upon quite heavily, because that's actual potential that has been achieved.
Maybe to just jump in here, I know John, we'll just have a John and Kathy thing. Hey, John, it's been forever. John, I know you raised a question last time about achievable potential estimates versus actual performance, and it made me think you might have some insights into that in particular markets, or maybe not.
Well, yes. I mean, as you probably know, I'm more on the industrial side of this, and and I was sort of going to wait till some I guess discussion on the industrial side, but that's what happened. I think last time was I felt that the industrial sector, at least, was again achievable potential, as you've already brought up, Kathy, is maybe a misnomer. But, it was, to me, not in line with what we have been achieving, again, over the last, at least 10 years, if not 20 years. So that just caused me, concern.
Yeah, thanks, John and Kathy, for that feedback. And Lincoln, maybe we can jump now to that next slide, which I think starts to potentially address some of your concerns, or at least it starts the conversation.
Yeah, thanks, Steve, and thanks, John and Kathy, and I believe it was Robin. I hope I'm getting that right. If I'm not, I apologize. I've got a strange name, and I hate it when people get my name wrong. So if it's not Robin, please forgive me. But I'm very grateful for your feedback, and I certainly understand your viewpoints. And I think that we're in a place where we obviously want to discuss reframing achievable potential. The slide 21 shows. Up until this point, I think that regardless of method used to estimate achievable potential, reframing it should probably occur. And so again, hear very clearly that from some folks and from other jurisdictions, another utility in the Midwest has done a potential study that excludes explicit estimates of achievable potential, or at least avoids using that term, as it can obviously probably mean different things to different people. And so this slide does provide a few options for reframing how we think about the results of the potential study, and ultimately, as Kathy noted, what does get communicated to policymakers and is used by individuals working on the quad planning process and organizations. So on the left-hand side, we do show, we could take an approach that's similar to the previous study, but instead of looking at 4 different achievable scenarios in our report as we did last time, perhaps just winnowing that down to 2, where we show a maximum achievable that's based on, again, imperfect though they may be, survey responses to questions about the percent of incremental cost that an incentive could cover if it covered the entire incremental cost, and the measure itself was therefore free to the customer. You know, what's the highest rate of participation we would see would be one option, and then the other option would be more of a business as usual achievable scenario that is constrained, and then we would, both in presentations and in report, you know, emphasize that achievable potential should be viewed as a range and not as a point estimate, due to the inherent uncertainty about, you know, people's future behaviors, organization future behaviors, and also the fact that markets change and shift and in directions unforeseen over time. And so this really is just not changing the methodology per se, but rather just reframing what it is that we present publicly and then also in a report, and then creating additional emphasis around the fact that, you know, achievable potential could mean different things to different people, and that due to the uncertainty, it should be viewed as a range. So the strengths of this approach, I believe, are that it uses a similar methodology to the 2016 potential study, so at least provides a basis of comparison going back in time, but acknowledges that the future is uncertain and that quad planning should consider a range of outcomes. You know, the limitations here is that you know, it does require a lot of careful consideration and thought around messaging and communications, and that people typically tend to prefer point estimates. Not everyone's an economist and can appreciate a range of uncertainties about the future. So that's one option that's presented here. The second option is to reframe the primary reported results on economic potential solely. And so it does remove, you know, the achievable potential subjectivity. It gets us away from having to, you know, explain the methodology behind a willingness to pay battery, and sort of remove some of the art away from the potential estimates and focuses solely on engineering assumptions around what's technical and then economic assumptions around what would be economic. Again, the primary limitation here is that it's a departure from the previous study, and that it does therefore then set a precedent for future studies, which may not be a limitation in everyone's eyes, but
and I thought we had done that. So was that still not specific enough? I thought that was all figured out when we had somebody do I don't know what the right phrase is for it, but they did sort of.
So someone who's talking on a cell phone in the background, if you could please mute yourself. Thank you. So again, the limitation is that it is a departure from the previous study, and does set a precedent for future studies. And so that's the last I had to say in terms of reframing the achievable potential. And the last slide in this section is just a chance for, again, additional open discussion and feedback. Any questions or comments that folks want to have about what we presented with respect to the utility data, but also options for estimating achievable potential or potentially reframing that achievable potential discussion.
Yeah, this is John again, and if you could address, just because I'll probably ask again if it doesn't. I'm just really trying to understand why I haven't heard anything about using the historical achieved savings with achieved budgets or set budgets. Why that's not being leaned on at all, it seems like, in this view, by sector, because I think that's actual achieved savings data. as opposed to, basing it on various surveys and instruments that you try to do, which I understand if you're talking about never having a program in a territory, you'd have to do. So I guess I'll stop there and just see what you can tell me about that.
Yeah, thanks, John. That's a great question, and I think I'm gonna try to answer it in a couple of parts. So we do obviously have a great wealth of historical information at our fingertips, and we do use some of that information primarily for determining ramp rates that I talked about previously on slide 19, where we look at, for specific measures and specific technologies, the rate at which we think those will be adopted over time. So it's not like we completely ignore historical data, but the follow-up to that is, how would we use historical information to estimate potential? And so in order to answer that completely, I need to backtrack a little bit and say, when we look at potential on a forward basis, we're estimating potential that is incremental to what's already been installed. And so I'm sorry if the person can possibly hear me who's talking right now. If you could mute your phone, that'd be great. Or if anybody from CADMAS has the ability to do that, that would be really helpful. But when we estimate potential looking on a going forward basis, it's incremental and additive to what's already been installed. And so, previous energy efficiency that's been achieved is now, in the baseline as of the base year when the potential study starts. And so we're looking to see what's available beyond already installed energy efficiency that's in the baseline. And one of the reasons why we don't just simply look back at history is that for some measures and sub-technologies, there may not be much energy efficiency potential left in the future. If we think about things like customer electronics or Energy Star products that have very high rates of adoption, looking back at what we've achieved over time may not be the best predictor of what we can achieve in the future. Other reasons would include, for some measures, some end uses, and some technologies, we've had changes to the underlying federal standards over time, and so the per unit savings for example, for residential lighting is probably a lot lower now than what it would have been, when savings were achieved, in 2014 or 15 or 16. And so we have to be careful about what it is we look back in history to use to develop estimates of what's going to happen in the future. And there's probably many other examples, but I think your point also gets to something else though, which is which may be useful is looking at various benchmarks. And so we do have all this information. We do know that measures and the measure stack and the efficiency of those measures change over time. Some things very rapidly, like commercial lighting. Some things less rapidly. Heat pump water heaters have technically been around for 40 years. And I think we could look at the data in aggregate and say, okay, over this period of time, here's what focus on energy has saved, and maybe move off the whole numbers, but look at those savings relative to what the sales were in those years. And so a way of normalizing the savings and saying, well, we think this is achievable because, hey, we've been doing it over time. And so I think that would be a useful basis of comparison for the work we're doing now. But I get nervous about relying solely on what programs have achieved year in and year out in the past and using that as a predictor of the future.
Lakin, if I can jump in there, I think because when we think about this sort of what the past illuminates to the future, I come back to heat pumps as a really interesting example, because I think under the survey scenario, asking Wisconsin households if they're likely to install what's essentially electric heat, given what we've taught them over the last 30 years about what they should use for heat, is an enormous challenge. I wouldn't be surprised if you did a willingness to pay and we saw a substantial group of the population saying, you know, of course not, I wouldn't take that heat pump if it was free. But the history of Wisconsin is that our utilities and then Focus has worked incredibly effectively with the HVAC market to deliver new technologies. You know, we were delivering ECM furnaces at a rate no one else was doing in the country before most states knew there were ECM furnaces. So there's, I think, kind of to build on John's point there, if we have to talk about something here, it seems like it's a discussion that should be much more driven by the program team. And I think that's why I keep coming back to, let's just stay at the economic, because the program team should then be talking to the commission about, given the funding we have, what are we going to accomplish this year with this? Because they know those markets and they know where they have that leverage. On the comparability, I guess I would like to hear you comment on if you did only do economic potential, you could compare that economic potential to the economic potential in the last study, which to me would be a really interesting exercise to understand how what is economic out there is shifting. Is it getting bigger because of federal standards and other things? Is it getting smaller? You know, that would be enormously useful. And I think works in a way, even if we don't talk about having the achievable comparison, you've still got economic in that previous study you could compare to.
Yeah, thanks, Kathy. And I certainly appreciate the viewpoint, and I'm not, I don't want to. Fortunately, you know, we don't have electrification as a scenario in this potential study right now, so I don't have to have to prognosticate about heat pump adoption over time. It's certainly going to be interesting to see, you know, see what happens there. But to your point about economic potential and the ability to compare between the two studies, yeah, you're exactly right. I think it's a relatively easy comparison. We do have to be conscientious of a few things that when we make that comparison. And so, you know, the first is the mix of measures, if those have changed somewhat over the last 3 or 4 years, if baselines have changed. So, you know, for some measures, there may be, you know, the market acceptance or the market penetration of some measures may have increased rather substantially, and so the baseline may have changed. I don't know. We haven't done a detailed dive on the measures yet. That's our next step in the study. Then,
isn't the same thing true though? Sorry, just to get at for the achievable potential, comparing it, you've got the same issues of a different mix of measures and adoption rates and whatever there too, don't you? When you're comparing achievable potential to previous?
You do, but I think I was just trying to highlight that, you know, economic is an apples to apples comparison, but there's a lot underlying that comparison that we should be aware of. Yes, it's the same is true for achievable, but to the extent that, you know, incremental cost change or the mix of measures is comparatively more expensive than they were in the previous study. For example, if there's a lot less residential lighting that can be relied on, then what falls under what may be economic may be quite different between the two studies. And then the other thing that we have to be cognizant of is if the underlying avoided energy forecasts have changed. And in this case, they will have changed. And they will have changed in some instances fairly substantially. And so I think it's certainly a good idea to compare economic potential back and forth between the two studies, but the inputs both on a measure specific basis and then an economic basis will have changed quite a bit.
The other point I'll just make between the two studies is that the avoided costs, as we mentioned in the last meeting, is quite different, about 30% less than the previous study. I do want to do a just a real quick time check here, because we do have a whole nother section here. Ben, I know you've been putting some things in the meeting chat. Happy to read them, or if you want to unmute. I just want to make sure everybody has a chance to talk before we move on.
Okay, so this is Ingo Bench at Evergreen Economics. Were you referring to me?
Yes, I think so. Yes.
Okay. I just wanted to comment that on this latest conversation, I agree with some of the points that Kathy's raising, that I think it'd be useful to take a deeper, more thoughtful approach to what do we want to do with achievable. And in particular, I think it's important to acknowledge that it's not just rebates that drive what consumers are going to do. There's the whole concept of a market transformation and how easy it is for people to adopt a new technology. Do they see it out in the marketplace? Are the programs or somebody else causing it to be visible? To what are the perceptions of the new technology among consumers? Do they know people who have tried it? All those kinds of things are the intangibles that matter, and the program and non-program elements help drive that. So just acknowledging that and incorporating that thinking into the how you approach what's achievable or not, or whether there's a constraint or not there, I think would be helpful. I think I'll stop with that because I think we could talk endlessly here, but I appreciate the you listening and the good conversation here.
Hey, and this is Mitch from PSC, and I just wanted to step in and thank. This has been a great discussion. I'm learning so much as I go along here, and really appreciate the perspectives. And this is what I was hoping we'd get, is multiple perspectives on this issue, and Lakin doing a spectacular job of presenting the options. And you know, from where I sit, and I would like to see this study, as others have said, really present results as scenarios for decision makers to really understand implications. With the climate change initiatives throughout the state, with the governor's carbon goal, the questions are how does focus fit in? Where could focus fit in? What's the future? And those are policy questions that we need to be able to make informed decisions about. So that's my interest here, is to make sure we are informing those decisions to the degree that we can, with all the great data and expertise involved in this study. So I'm really happy to hear this discussion and these perspectives, and they're, you know, we're going to continue this conversation and keep these comments at the, on the front burner as we move along in the study. So I really do want to thank everybody.
Yeah, thanks for that, Mitch. And I'll just also mention that if you do have any additional comments after today's meeting, feel free to email either Lakin or Mitch, and we'll be sure to get back to you on any questions or comments you have. So before we move on to the next section, are there any last minute thoughts from this group? All right. Jeremy, I think I can hand it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Steve. Lakin, I'm just going to ask you to advance slides. I don't think I can control it in this mode. Thank you. So my name is Jeremy Eckstein. I'm with Cadmus, and I am going to run us through the slides on our 2020 data collection proposal. And that's going to include a couple of different parts. We'll start at a very high level, talking about what we actually use our primary data for, to provide some context for you. Then we'll have a brief discussion about what we collected in the previous potential study in 2016. And then we'll actually talk about the various options that we wanted to put before you. And also, we have Aquila Valonis on the line, who is calling in from a coffee shop on his vacation, who is the kind of the lead for this particular task in the last potential study, and who's our measure characterization lead this time around. So you may hear from him as well. So I think you can go to the next slide, please. So why do we collect why do we go through the whole primary data collection process? Well, collecting data on site and from customers and about buildings in Wisconsin allows us to get an accurate and localized and current picture of the market for our potential study and for our measure characteristics. So that's really why we go through this, and we have a couple of different ways in which we are able to collect data. Of course, we have surveys, which can be both implemented through the phone or through emails, and help us collect at a kind of a more high level information about equipment, saturations, the types of fuels that they use, the level of penetration, and of course, we've already talked about our customer responses for achievable potential. Now, site visits, where engineering techs actually go on site and walk through buildings and measure things themselves, provide a much more detailed view into the condition and the characteristics of the buildings that we're looking at, as well as the types of equipments that are installed there, such as like the efficiency levels, and particularly when it comes to lighting, the types of lighting systems, the wattages and controls and fixture types. We also use secondary data, and that's both used to fill in any potential gaps in our primary data. And here we would rely primarily on public information from the Energy Information Administration with their residential energy consumption surveys, or the commercial building energy consumption surveys, or manufactured building energy consumption surveys. So, and then we also have the TRM, which helps us characterize our measures for costs and actual savings. And so between these data sources, we essentially do a market characterization that kind of provides a baseline view of the Wisconsin building stock. And allows us to see where the energy saving measures can then be applied. So it's a bottom up baseline forecast of the characteristics based on all of the detailed equipment, saturation and fuel share information that we collect, and then together they provide us an estimate of the remaining energy efficiency potential in this market that we're looking at. You can go ahead. And so we also wanted to provide an overview of our 2016 data collection effort. And this is primarily to show you the real extent of this effort. So we collected a lot of information about the Wisconsin market with a lot of site visits and also phone surveys, and have developed a really deep database on the market. And so through hundreds of site visits, we had a lot of baseline information that we used for the previous potential study, but that can also be leveraged for the current potential study. So, you know, I see, you can see the kind of data points speak for themselves, but essentially we had an extensive site visit process and complemented with so in-depth surveys in the commercial sector and also industrial and agricultural sectors. And so all of this data, like I said, is still something that we have access to as we plan our current potential study data collection methods. So you can go to the next slide. And so our question was, how do we leverage this data, and what do we need to collect for this current potential study? And what we did was to go through our database and to essentially rank the various items, hundreds of items in our database on 3 criteria. And one was, what's the likelihood that anything about this has changed since the data was collected in 2016? And the other point was, what was the depth of the data that was collected? So what kind of instruments did we use? What kind of sample sizes did we have, say, for various building segments? And then also, importantly, we ranked all of these points based on the importance that they have for this current potential study. So this was kind of a 3-point ranking system. And based on this index, we identified our current data collection priorities. And really, at the top of that list is information about commercial lighting systems. That is both a rapidly changing market and a very important potential source of energy efficiency savings. Additionally, we want to prioritize collecting information about commercial and industrial motors and drives to understand where new energy efficient technologies are applicable. Additionally, commercial space heating controls and residential thermostats were at the top of the list. Now, while some of this information can be collected through surveys, we find that site visits are pretty essential for collecting the lighting information due to basically low resolution in any information that we get on the phone with a facility manager or on-site staff. It's just, in our experience, been best to actually have someone on site looking at the equipment. And that is also the case for any data about the efficiency levels or capacity levels of equipment that's on site. Again, it's very difficult to collect that information without having a tech look at that equipment themselves. And go ahead. And of course, conducting site visits during the time of the coronavirus may be challenging, and it's especially challenging to make any kind of plan for collecting the data on site, also because the the situation is changing very, very quickly, as I'm sure everyone on this call has been following. So it may not be feasible to do in-person site visits within this study timeframe, and that would be both for the safety of our staff and also for the safety and well-being of anyone that they would come into contact with. So it's difficult to plan, as the situation may still evolve, and we simply don't know what things will look like in another month. So what we propose is to conduct a pilot of a quote-unquote virtual site visit to collect the most critical lighting data identified in previous slides and select equipment data, and to actually use our virtual site visits as a way to collect this information from the commercials sector, should they prove successful, and should going on site in person not be advisable or feasible. And these pictures on the right are from virtual site visits that were conducted in Oregon, I believe, and show kind of how we are able to collect information. And the next slide, you can go, has a bit more information about how we would design our virtual site visit pilot, and essentially what we would propose to do is to conduct 8 visits across 3 commercial building segments for office, retail, and schools, and then conduct these in late July and assess feasibility shortly thereafter to understand if this is something that we are able to do on a much wider scale for our primary data collection effort. And so the way that this would work is that we would recruit sites from the same sample and that we would develop for an overall data collection plan. So incorporating the segmentation information that Lakin has discussed early in this presentation. We would offer incentives to facility staff or building managers to participate. We would program our data collection instruments, which is kind of a tablet that feeds into a database directly, and essentially treat these as a regular site visit. This is an instrument that we typically use for on-site visits. And then instead of going on site, we would use a video call. So that would be an app like WhatsApp or FaceTime or whatever is convenient for the on-site staff to actually walk through the building with that video. The tech can have ask the on-site person to get closer to equipment, to take pictures of what they see on site, and basically our engineering tech is there virtually and is guiding the on-site staff through the building as a virtual walkthrough. The limitation to this is that when we send engineering techs to a site, they I don't want to say they have limitless time, but they have a lot more time to collect information than we can ask of an on-site staff. So we can't ask someone to do this video call through for a whole day on a large facility. So they need to be really focused. These virtual site visits need to be very focused on the on the most critical data collection priorities that we identified above. So lighting information, and then select equipment capacity and efficiency data. And our next slide would show how this all fits together at the commercial level. So for the commercial data collection, we have essentially two options. And before talking any more about the distributions of phone surveys and virtual site visits or on-site visits for that matter, should they be possible, I would just say that because there's limitations to how much data we can collect in a virtual site visits, there does need to be a complementary phone survey with them to collect additional information that's important about things like equipment saturations that we wouldn't be able to get through asking someone to do a walkthrough. And so the first option, and this would be our recommended path, would be to do focused virtual site visits in 3 building segments, and then additional phone surveys across all commercial building segments, and then use the essentially extrapolate to those segments that we didn't visit the changes in say lighting equipment saturations that we identified in offices, retails, and schools, essentially based on the changes in those segments from the previous study. And the benefit of this particular approach is that it allows for a comparison over time for those 3 segments that we would target. So these are the largest energy consuming segments, but would also allow updates to all segments, of course, with an emphasis on the 3 largest ones. The drawback here is that the key lighting and equipment data is really only collected at the high precision and confidence for those 3 segments that are shown here. And then the other option on the next slide is to basically spread our site visits or virtual site visits across all building segments, and again complement with phone surveys, and the benefit here is that key lighting and equipment data is essentially collected everywhere. The other benefit is that this data may be useful to program implementers for program design considerations, but then the drawback is that we only have very high precision and confidence at the sector level. You can go ahead to the next slide. And this fairly wordy slide here essentially shows what we are able to collect with these different methods, either through virtual site visits or on-site visits. And what you're basically seeing is that the virtual site visits and the on-site visits are pretty similar in terms of being able to collect detailed information about lighting characteristics, but then it's more limited for other types of information about, say, motor controls or heating and cooling equipment data. And with an on-site visit, we would be able to go into more depth on additional items. The phone surveys provide additional important information that is useful, but it tends to be more of the general nature due to factors that I explained earlier, such as just not being able to really ask the detailed types of questions over the phone. So it's more general about what type of heating and cooling systems do you use, rather than what are their capacities and their efficiency levels. You can move ahead. And then this slide shows what we have for the non-commercial sectors for our proposal. And these are focused, so no, we're not proposing site visits for these. We're proposing either surveys or expert interviews. And for the residential sector, we are thinking that we may be able to do email surveys, and we're still sorting through some of the utility data to see how feasible that would be. But either phone or email surveys across two building types, so for single family and multifamily homes, and essentially these surveys would focus on key equipment or key data priorities, such as what types of thermostats are in place, the estimates of their lighting saturations, and then we can leverage information that we collected through our extensive site visits in 2016, and for which we expect fairly little change or more limited change to current times, such as insulation levels or air infiltration levels. So we would rely on that data to complement what we would collect through our surveys. Now, for the industrial sector, we would propose to conduct interviews with an expert panel of industrial experts to collect information about kind of key opportunities for industrial improvements. And this is something that we actually did, and I think I didn't mention that in our 2016 data collection overview, but we actually used this approach for the previous study, and it was really successful and very helpful, and I think Aquila may be able to speak more to that. And then for the agricultural sector, again, we would complement our very extensive data collection, on-site data collection effort with survey research, most likely phone surveys, and build upon it there. you can go to the next slide. So I think may have gone through this fairly quickly. We are here to answer questions or comments. There's a couple of ideas here for what you may want to comment or provide questions on. There's no limit. I suppose we'd be interested to hear about in the commercial sector feedback on option 1 or option 2 or anything else that you have questions about. Any questions, Steve?
No questions yet.
Quila, do you want to add anything?
Well, this is John Nickel. I'll ask a question that's on my mind in terms of the panel on the industrial experts, I guess. And I understand you did that in the first or your last potential study. I guess get those folks from.
Hey, John, are you still there?
I'm still here, yeah. Did you hear my question, I guess?
It broke up on my end. I'm not sure if it was my connection or.
Let me just repeat it. It's just a question on the panel of experts, I guess, for the industrial sector. I'm just wondering, where you're getting those folks from. I guess you did that the first, or your last potential study. Just wondering about that, I guess.
Hello, this is Aquila. Hopefully you guys can hear me okay. I can help answer that, John. From the last study, we had a few folks from Focus on Energy's implementation team that worked with some very specific industrial facilities throughout the state, and these experts comprised of some folks that were very knowledgeable about a specific industry like pulp or paper, and they were on our panel. That a lot of the folks that we reached out to, they like I said, were part of the implementation team for Focus on Energy, but there were also we sent out a broad email to other key folks. I don't have the list in front of me here, but they were pretty they were very knowledgeable of what was going on the ground for a lot of the key industries, and they provided some pretty important feedback. I know that we're going to be gathering that list of names to reach out to. So if there are some folks that you can think of that should be on that list, by all means, please pass those along, because we want to make sure that we have the right. We want to make sure we contact the right folks.
Yeah, that sounds good. And again, if there's anything I can do in terms of, I know it's obviously all this is a big challenge, and especially within the industrial market, because there's so many different types of processes that are going on, right? And the potential there for various things that I think we take pride in, I guess, given that Focus on Energy is by the report from the LBL National Laboratory, most cost-effective program in the country. One of the reasons is because of this approach with our subject matter experts on these industrial processes. It's just a really good bang for the buck. And so I just want to make sure that that's represented, in an adequate way.
Yes, that makes sense. Sorry for the wind.
Thanks, John. Kathy has a question. Did the focus program staff have input into identifying which measures that we'll focus on? Maybe I can take a quick stab, and Aquila and Jeremy, you can step in. The whole measure characterization and what measures we will focus on as far as determining the potential for is a coming task, and the focus program team will have input into that, as well as this stakeholder group as well. That will be another upcoming meeting. I believe we're scheduling it for early fall. And then question from Zach. For the commercial sector, is 3 facility types the limit, open to adding or swapping? So for the commercial sector, I think you're referring to that option 1. We did focus on the sectors that have traditionally the most potential. We do not have resources to go across all of the other sectors. We would be interested in hearing if you think there should be realignment with those three sectors. So if you have suggestions for other segments that you think we should be looking at, feel free to unmute now or send a follow-up email.
This is Zach. Here's the one question I wanted to ask is, I guess we've been trying to focus more on healthcare, but I guess given the current pandemic situation, that might be kind of problematic to get any real information or site visits completed for that segment. So kind of looking more at, is there something we can do for that if it's a segment that hasn't been the top savings getter, but maybe we're interested in expanding. So not saying that we need to cover all segments, but saying could we add one if there's a strong need.
So I heard sorry, it was a bit soft, but that you have an interest in healthcare. I think it would be challenging to get 68 site visits done in that environment, both because probably folks are going to be very busy on site, and then especially for in-person site visits. And also I believe that it's also been traditionally challenging to get information there. But the reason we laid out option 1 and 2, which is to cover a couple of segments in depth, and then to cover more segments in I suppose with fewer site visits, is to get that kind of information to folks that are interested in very segment specific data. So what essentially I think I'm hearing from you is that there's some interest in option 2, which would be to collect at least some level of data from the healthcare sector, segment.
Yes, just curious to kind of help dial in what we've been targeting, if we should continue to target that, or if given current situation that it's not not worthwhile at this time until pandemic is kind of over or something like that. So just a thought. I haven't cleared this with anybody on the commercial team specifically, just wondering if it's an option.
I think so. Sorry, Steve, were you about to say something?
Yes, I was going to say we, at this point have made no final decision, so that's appreciative feedback. Any other comments or thoughts, questions around the data collection or anything that we presented earlier on in the presentation before we adjourn?
Hey, Steve, this is Mitch. When are you guys going to start the pilot?
We're hoping to start it in late July.
Okay, well, I'd be interested, maybe update this group in terms of how successful that is. I know cannot be the only, people doing this kind of thing, virtual visits. So hopefully we see success there. But yeah, we maybe should circle back with this group and just let them know that how the pilots went and things like that.
Yeah, good suggestion, Mitch. Happy to do that.
Lakin, do you want to advance to the final slide? I suppose I'll talk to this. It doesn't sound like we have any other remaining questions. I would, I suppose, reiterate that anything else that comes to mind, feel free to email Lakin or Mitch, and also a reminder that our next stakeholder meeting would cover the measures that we're considering for this study. So our team is already developing started developing a draft list, and we would post that for feedback and then have a whole discussion around the measures that we're looking at for energy efficiency potential. I'm not sure if you have something to add to that, Mitch.
I'd just add that I'll follow up with an email when these slides are posted to the website and the recording as well. So for people that were not able to join, they can come back and see those materials. And that's yeah. So look for an email from me on that. And then also if there's anyone that you know of that's not receiving these meeting invites or not on the stakeholder list that should be, always feel free to send them my way, and I'll make sure that they get the communications.
Great. Well, thanks, Mitch. I think that concludes today's presentation. Thanks everyone for joining. Looking forward to talking to you guys in a couple months, and hope you have a good rest of your day.
Thanks, everybody.